over the course of the next few lectures, we'll be going over various aspects of the pulmonary system. We already covered pulmonary circulation. Today's lecture we will cover pulmonary ventilation, which encompasses the physical act of getting air into and out of the lungs. Next lecture we'll be covering the diffusion of gases across the respiratory membrane. Later we'll look at how the gases are transported. Then we will look at how respiration is regulated, and then the final lecture we'll look over special respirations such as being in a hypo or hyperbaric environments, which include high altitude respirations and respiration while you're diving. What we're going to do today is pulmonary ventilation. We're going to be looking at various concepts associated with it, which include looking over different pressures and how they have to be in order to get air into and out of the lungs. We'll be looking at some concepts such as compliance and how it applies to the lungs. And we'll also be looking at various lung volumes and capacities. So first thing I want to do is just introduce you to respiratory function. Some of the things that the respiratory system does for us. Now most of you automatically just could say, oh, respiratory system is all about gas exchange. Yes, and that's obviously what we're going to spend the most time on. But you need to realize that the respiratory system is involved in acid-base balance, that if you change your ventilation, you can affect your pH of your blood. And it's one of the ways our bodies compensate for acid-base imbalances, and it also could be a cause of an acid-base imbalance, such as, for example, if someone hyperventilates, they blow off a lot of carbon dioxide, which could lead to what we call respiratory alkalosis. It should have been covered briefly in Biochemistry 1 when you learned about buffers, but we will be doing it briefly this try and again next trimester. The respiratory system obviously is involved in phonation, which is how we produce sound. You need it for nonverbal communication, like grunting, just making weird noises, singing. So it's involved in that. But also, respiratory system is involved in your metabolism. We've already talked about how it's involved indirectly in blood pressure regulation because angiotensin converting enzyme is produced in the lungs, and it permits the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And also what we will be talking about today is that the lungs produce surfactant. And surfactant is a very important factor that you need for proper function of your lungs. What we're going to start though is go into parts of your respiratory passageways and look at their functions. So I'm going to start off in the nasal cavity. So if you look at this section of someone's nasal cavity, the nasal cavity has what we call air conditioning functions. The way it's designed, the mucosa that surrounds that, or should say lines the nasal cavity, the turbinates or the nasal conchae, which you see right here, the hairs that are in your nasal cavity, they all serve a function which include warming the air, humidification of the air, and filtering of that air. The whole idea, when you start with breathing air in through your nose, and by the time you get down to the alveoli where gas exchange takes place, is to protect those very delicate alveoli from either being dried out or the air being too cool, because very cold air can cause constriction of your bronchi, which would cause some problems getting air into and out of your lungs. Plus, so you're breathing a lot of pathogens and debris that are coming in the air. You want to protect that from getting down and damaging the alveoli. So if you think about how your nasal cavity is lined, it is very vascular, and it provides a very good mechanism for warming and humidifying the air. As air comes in, it's also very good at helping to cool the air as the air comes out. The epithelium that lines it secretes mucus, and that mucus helps to trap debris, and also the membrane also, because it's has that mucus, helps to humidify that air that as it's coming in. The nose hairs that you have help to filter out some of the larger debris that comes in. The way the turbinates of bone are designed is it creates a lot of turbulence that any large particles can filter out of the air and get trapped in the mucus. And what happens is that mucus moves down here, and you can actually swallow that mucus and get rid of the pathogens, because when it hits your stomach, all that acid in your stomach, kills any possible pathogens that went in there, and any debris is just going to be broken down. So that nasal cavity, and including as you keep going down the tracheobronchial tree, that will still serve to help to warm, humidify, and filter the air. If anything makes its way down into the alveoli, we actually do have a means to protect against pathogens, as you have macrophage that are there to pick up anything that may have escaped the mechanisms by which we have to get rid of those pathogens. If you look at this section of the epithelium that lines the majority of your tracheobronchial tree, this is, you learned in Cells and Tissues, as PCCE, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. It looks like it's stratified, but it isn't. It's just one single layer. It just kind of looks like you got to see the nuclei here, that there's more than one layer, but it isn't. Just some of them are a little bit, here's one that goes all the way up. It's actually one layer, and here's another one, another cell. If you notice, these are the glands that secrete mucus, and here are the cilia. And the cilia beat, you got about like at least 200 cilia per cell that beat about 12 to 20 times a minute. And if you have this in the nasal cavity, it beats downwards, so you can swallow this and get rid of it that way. But this picture also shows what you would have like lower down, maybe in the trachea, where this are particles that got trapped in the mucus. These cilia are going to be upwards, and it acts as a escalator. We call it a respiratory escalator. So it moves up again into your mouth, and you swallow it. So this is very helpful in protecting your delicate airways from getting damaged. The one thing, a little clinical correlation, is if you smoke. Cigarette smoke contains compounds that can paralyze the cilia, and so smokers are more prone to respiratory infections. If you have cystic fibrosis, people with that condition, the mucus is very, very thick, and it becomes too thick, so it makes it very difficult to move that mucus up the respiratory tract, and so they're also prone to more respiratory infections. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the tracheobronchial tree, the various components of the tracheobronchial tree, starting from the trachea, then going into the primary bronchi where it branches off, secondary bronchi, bronchioles all the way down, and including the alveoli. And we're going to look at various components and how it's structured and their function. Now, one thing want you to notice on this picture in the trachea, notice what's in blue. These are your C rings. And that's composed of cartilage. So I want to go through what's in your notes, this picture here, that goes through the different components of the respiratory tree, which they call the tracheobronchial tree. As the air comes in, it flows through a series of branching airways. Now, each branching airway is referred to as being a generation or an order, which is characterized by this letter Z. So this refers to, each of these refers to as generations. The generations is where each branches. So you start with generation 0, which is the trachea. Where it first branches will be your primary bronchi, and that would be generation 1. And then when it branches again, it's generation 2, and it keeps going on down. Now, you do what you need to know with these, with the numbers of the generations. You do need to know that the first 17 generations, which includes 0 through 16, that adds up to 17, the first 17 generations comprises what we refer to as the conducting zone. So you need to know that from 0 to 16, those are part of the conducting zone. You really don't need to know that, oh, generation 4 is the bronchioles. You don't have to know that. Just know that 0 to 16 is the conducting zone. And what the conducting zone, why they call it the conducting zone, this is where we're just moving air. There's absolutely no gas exchange. We're just conducting the air in to where we can get to these areas down here, which you see in the light gray. These represent the alveoli. So conducting zone, think of it as more of a pipeline. There's no alveoli, there's no gas exchange. You'll also hear it referred to as anatomical dead space. So understand that the reason why they call it anatomical dead space is there is absolutely no gas exchange. So it's dead. Didn't do anything. All we're doing is moving the air in. You can calculate someone's anatomical dead space. It is calculated as being about 1 ml per pound of ideal body weight. So this does not change if you gain weight. It's for your ideal body weight for your body size. So if your ideal body weight is 150 pounds, you have 150 mils of anatomic dead space. That will be important at a later date or later time where we need to calculate various things like alveolar ventilation or other ventilation. So you need to be able to calculate this anatomic dead space. Everybody has anatomical dead space. What you'll notice, which is in this conducting zone, is you've got the trachea, which has those C-rings, the cartilage, and the purpose of the C-rings is to keep the trachea open, because during inspiration air pressure declines and it would tend to collapse the trachea, so it remains it open during breathing, especially obviously during inspiration. In this area right here, your generations 1, 2, and 3, you have the bronchi. The bronchi still contain cartilage, but they're little plates, or like little pieces of cartilage. When you get down to the bronchioles have absolutely no cartilage. Now in Cells and Tissues lab, you were given slides and you had to determine, was this a bronchi or bronchioles? And you always looked for the little piece of cartilage. If it got a little piece of cartilage, it was a bronchi. If it didn't, it was a bronchiole. Now the bronchioles have, since they don't have cartilage, they have smooth muscle, which we're going to be seeing. They also contain elastin fibers. And the elastic fibers that surround the bronchioles are kind of important in helping to keep the airways somewhat open, but they do have the ability to collapse because of being without cartilage. The smooth muscle layer that surrounds these will become important because the smooth muscle is sensitive to various factors which may result in bronchoconstriction or bronchodilation, and we'll be going over some of those. As you know, when we get down to the end of the conducting zone is the terminal bronchioles. And the reason why they call them terminal is that it's the end of conduction. Once you get into where the respiratory bronchioles, which is generations 17 through 19, which is, again, you do need to know that generations 17 through 19 comprise the transitional zone. And this is where the respiratory bronchioles are located. You'll notice this is where some gas exchange occurs because you see the presence of alveoli. So there is some gas exchange. When you get to the respiratory zone, which is comprised of generations 20 to 23, you have your alveolar ducts and your alveolar sacs. So you have a lot of alveoli here. So this is where most of your gas exchange will take place. Most of your lungs is composed of the respiratory zone. So the reason why they call this one the transitional zone is because we're transitioning between conduction and respiration. So there is some respiration or some gas exchange taking place here. Now if we look at a graph or a picture that tries to depict actually we'll come back to this picture in a second. Let's go back to this. This is trying to show you, here's the smooth muscle that surrounds the terminal bronchiole, and you see all these elastic fibers that surround the alveoli. These are all the alveoli. Remember we had talked about the capillaries, or just that cover those alveoli like sheets, and so it looks like the blood is just covering the alveoli like sheets. The alveoli are also just surrounded by all these elastic fibers, which will become important when we talk about when we talk about ventilation, inspiration and expiration. Now, this graph depicts the relationship between those generations, 0 through 23, and total cross-sectional area of our airways. If you notice most of your lung tissue is found in the respiratory zone. So look at the total cross-sectional area in the respiratory zone. It's huge. And remember, the respiratory zone is those generations 20 to 23. And so there's only a few generations there, but you've got tons of alveoli. So this is where most of your lung tissue is found, is in the respiratory zone. From the rest of it is the conducting zone. And the conducting zone is, again, starts from your nose, goes on down to generation 6. And what you'll see here in the conducting zone, they refer to that as the area of bulk flow. So air is just moving by bulk flow. It's coming in and just kind of going with the flow. When it gets down to the respiratory zone, this is the area of diffusion. The air will move by the laws of diffusion from high pressure to low pressure. The size of the airways does not matter when you're in that respiratory zone, because as you move down to the tracheobronchial tree, those airways get smaller and smaller and smaller. So you would think that because in the respiratory zone, since it's so small, you would not be able to get air to move. But what follows that is the laws of diffusion. It goes from high pressure to low pressure. Size of the airway will not matter. Obviously in here, the size of the airway will. If you have a bigger airway, you're going to be able to move it down a little bit more. But I want to show you something. If you look at here, showing you the airway generations and resistance, you'll notice that most of the resistance to airflow is right up here, which is about where you have your medium-sized bronchi. So you would think that as the size of the airways got smaller and smaller and smaller, resistance should be higher. But you'll notice resistance drops as we move down to the airway generations. So I was like, why is that? Well, as the total cross-sectional area increases, what happens is resistance drops. The way these things are arranged, again, are kind of pretty much in parallel instead of series. Total resistance is low. And then if you notice when you start, this is terminal bronchioles, when you get in here, doesn't matter. You don't really have to worry about resistance to airflow. The gas is moving by the principles of diffusion. So you don't really have to worry about the flow equation. Remember the flow equation. Flow is delta P over R, where you say, well, resistance is really high, then flow should be really low. But resistance is not an issue. Notice, look at resistance is really low when you get in here because of, when you think about it, in the gas exchange areas, it's the laws of diffusion that apply. When you're in the conducting zone, normally the resistance is not a big deal. When someone's breathing normally, in relatively speaking, when you look up in this area, the airways are really not that small. So overall, we don't have to worry about resistance to airflow that much, but just like anything else, I always have to tell you what happens if I change resistance, which can happen, and we're going to give you some clinical examples in a moment. So we will be discussing this in a moment and going back to that flow equation. Now, just to kind of review with you structural changes that happen in the airways. This is the ET, is an abbreviation for epithelium. So your epithelium does change as you move down to the tracheobronchial tree. Most of the tracheobronchial tree is composed of PCCE, but as it goes to the terminal bronchioles, it'll start transitioning to more simple columnar or even simple cuboidal epithelium when you start getting into terminal bronchioles. When you get to the alveoli, this one's real important to know, is in the alveoli, which you see tons in here. The epithelium is simple squamous. And what is the significance of having simple squamous epithelium in the alveoli? Remember, it's all about gas exchange. We want it very thin so we can have rapid gas exchange. But the other one, though, I still want you to make sure you remember PCCE for the majority of your tracheobronchial tree. The cartilage will also change. You start off with your C-rings, and then it transitions to the little plates of cartilage. And you notice down here, once you get down to the bronchioles, I should say bronchioles, there is no cartilage. So here's the trachea, here's a primary bronchi, you got your secondary bronchi, you end up, you got your tertiary bronchi, but once you get to the bronchioles, there is no cartilage from there on. The amount, which we don't have it on here, the smooth muscle does change. You have a little bit more smooth muscle here than you have up here, which will be sensitive to various things, which could potentially in this area here, or even maybe here, cause changes in the size of the airways, which could affect resistance and therefore affect airflow. So I want to do is look at what things that could affect airflow, because these things do happen, so we do have to talk about them. So there is a relationship with your lung volume and your resistance to airflow. So if you look at a graph that's going to depict lung volume and resistance, what you'll notice is as volume increases, resistance decreases. And you can try this out. If you say take a deep breath in and exhale it out, but don't exhale all that air that you just took in your lungs out. Kind of stay at a higher lung volume. You'll notice that it's a little bit easier to breathe up at the higher lung volumes. If you blow a whole bunch of air out of your lungs and then inhale again, but don't go back to your normal lung volume, resting lung volume, and try to breathe at a lower lung volume, it's much more difficult. So there's higher resistance to airflow at low lung volumes, and it's less resistance to airflow at the high lung volumes. Think of this this way. You've got your lung tissue that is by radial traction, that as your lungs expand, your rib cage expands, the bronchi kind of get pulled open and increases their size as the lung expands. So it's a little bit easier to breathe at the higher lung volumes. If you're at a lower lung volume, you can start getting collapse of the airways, and so it makes it's much more difficult to breathe. So I want you to again think of the flow equation. Flow is equal to delta P over R. If resistance is high, flow is decreased. If resistance is low, flow is increased. So let's look at it regarding the bronchial smooth muscle. That bronchial smooth muscle that lines those airways is very responsive to factors that could change the diameter. And we're going to be giving you some examples after we finish this slide. If you have a factor that results in bronchoconstriction, what will that do to resistance? So think of it when you did the vascular system. Same things apply. If you constrict the bronchi, resistance increases. So what will happen to flow? In this case, we're talking about airflow. Flow will decrease. And on the other hand, if you have a factor that dilates the bronchi, nice word, broncho, so I actually spelled this wrong, there should be an O in here, bronchodilation will result in a decrease in resistance, and therefore airflow will increase. So I want you to kind of think about, just take a moment, think about what things could probably result in bronchoconstriction, what things can cause bronchodilation. You could probably use an example of exercise, and what would you want to happen during exercise. You can also think of if you've got allergies. what do you think would be a scenario? So just kind of keep that in mind, and it's what we're going to be looking at in a moment. Another thing that can affect airflow is the viscosity and the density of the air. The density of air can be affected if you're diving, just breathing compressed air. This one, viscosity, think of like what would happen if you go outside and it's really humid. Have you ever gone outside where it was really, really humid? Was it harder to breathe? And I've experienced that, and it's like, wow, it's really, really hard to breathe when it's very humid out. So what you need to think of is as viscosity or the density of the air increases, resistance increases, and therefore flow will decrease. So that's what I want you to remember. So let's look at some stuff that could affect this bronchial smooth muscle. So first thing we've got to look at is your autonomic nervous system. What is the effects of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system? Overall, the autonomic nervous system doesn't play a huge role in the control of your bronchial smooth muscle. The sympathetics, there's very little or no direct effect because we don't really have a lot of innervation of the bronchial smooth muscle by the sympathetics. But the little tiny bit that you have, what would happen, I want you to think about what would happen. When you're in sympathetic mode, think exercise. What would you want to happen? You want to have better airflow. So what's going to happen is you'll have a little bit of bronchodilation. The parasympathetics, here, again, it's kind of more of a spillover effect of the parasympathetics. You can get a very low level of smooth muscle constriction when you're in parasympathetic mode, and a slight increase in mucus production. And most of us are not really aware of that because it's minor. The autonomic nervous system does not play a huge role in the control of the bronchial smooth muscle because, again, not a lot of innervation. The only people that may notice the effects of the parasympathetics are people with maybe emphysema or asthma. Is they'll notice that after they eat, or then they're in more parasympathetic mode, they have a little bit more constriction, a little bit more mucus production, so they have a harder time breathing after they eat. I don't notice that because I do not have asthma. What is more important in the control of your bronchial smooth muscle is things like the humoral factors, things found in your blood. So I'm going to put a star by this one. That's a very important thing involved in the control of your bronchial smooth muscle. Your catecholamines, such as epinephrine, which would be released when you were in fight or flight mode. And remember, this is coming from the adrenal medulla. Now, although we don't have innervation by the autonomic nervous system, you still have receptors for epinephrine. And so, in the receptors that you'll see on the bronchial smooth muscle will be the beta 2 receptors, and what you will have is bronchodilation. Now think of, when would this become important? Just keep it in mind, when would this be important besides obviously exercise? So when you're exercising, you want to be able to get a lot of air into and out of your lungs when you're exercising. Obviously, that's definitely important. Local factors at the tissue level, things that are produced at the tissue level, are also pretty important in the control of your bronchial smooth muscle. So I'm going to put another star by this one. Oop, you see I have something up here, but we'll come back down to it. The histamine, which can be produced by mast cells in your lung tissue in response to allergens. The histamine can cause on bronchial smooth muscle cause significant constriction, and the receptors on there cause constriction of the bronchial smooth muscle. But remember, it also causes vasodilation. So remember, on blood vessels, it relaxes the smooth muscle and blood vessels, but it constricts the bronchial smooth muscle, so it makes it more difficult for you to breathe because of histamine. This thing called slow reacting substance of anaphylaxis, SRA, is also produced by those mast cells. This is something, again, that causes constriction. And why do they call this anaphylaxis? Is if you've got a significant allergic reaction, it can lead to significant bronchial constriction, but also cause massive vasodilation and lead to shock or anaphylactic shock. So, I wonder how I can utilize something to my advantage if I am a person who has significant allergies, where if, for example, I am very allergic to bees. If I'm very allergic to bees and I get stung by a bee and I have so much bronchoconstriction I can't breathe, you won't last very long. And so what do these people carry with them? They usually carry EpiPens, and the EpiPens are designed, you pull the cap off, you kind of stab yourself in the leg, and what it does, it's designed to go right through blue jeans. Okay, this thing is not a tiny little needle. It'll go right through the blue jeans and injects you with epinephrine. So what it's going to do is open up those airways so you can have improved gas exchange until you have time to go to the hospital. So it's pretty important that epinephrine is a bronchodilator. Also something else that could affect the bronchial smooth muscle, and you see here a public service announcement: do not pepper spray yourself, because the various irritants that you can inhale, like pepper spray, it's designed to be a protective response. These irritants could damage the delicate airways, so all of a sudden it'll close off your airways and all of a sudden you can't breathe. But it's trying to prevent those irritants from making its way down into your alveoli. And the reason why this is a public service announcement about not pepper spraying yourself is because I have pepper sprayed myself more than once. Okay, so one technically wasn't a direct pepper spray myself. So when I first moved to Texas, I worked at Southwestern Medical Center, and they have parking garages, and I would have to park up at the very top of the parking garage. And you know how Texas gets very, very hot. And also moving down to Texas, I had to worry about, Dallas area, protecting myself. So I used to have a little thing of pepper spray that I'd keep on my keychain. Well, for some reason it wasn't on my keychain that day, and I had left it in my car. So I leave work, go open my car door, and all of a sudden went, I stopped breathing immediately, and it felt like I had swallowed a whole bunch of bumblebees. My eyes, I moved away from the car really quick. I couldn't see. My eyes were watering. I couldn't breathe right away. But then, of course, I started breathing again because I moved my way from it. And I couldn't figure out what was wrong. So I stumbled my way back to my office, called my husband, and said, I don't know what just happened. He says, and you think being a PhD, I would be able to figure this one out for myself, but I didn't. He said, go back to the car, just keep your head away from the car, open the door, unroll the windows, and wait for it to air out, and then get in the car. Okay, I did that, obviously. When I got in the car, all of a sudden I saw pieces of the pepper spray, the little personal pepper spray thing, all over my car. I'm like, oh, the thing exploded in my car, and it stayed all concentrated in the car. So as soon as I opened up the car, I inhaled it. So it was awful. Well, I said, I've pepper sprayed myself twice. So at a later date, we were just messing around, and I had sprayed a little bit of pepper spray in a room in New York. And people don't have central air in New York. Most of us don't. There was a fan way across the room. Well, I sprayed it. I was just trying to show someone some I don't know why I was doing it. Sprayed it, and the fan caught it and blew it back in my face. And so I pepper sprayed myself again. So tells you being a PhD doesn't mean you're all that smart. Okay, so I've pepper sprayed myself twice. But my body definitely innate kicked in, and I stopped breathing pretty quick so that stuff would not make its way down to those airways. The things like various smokes, various aerosols, different toxins in the air can cause you to close off those airways. So here, do not pepper spray yourself by any means. Alright, we can stop now with that. Alright, so what we're going to do now is start going over into the mechanics of pulmonary ventilation. And what we're going to be referring to is something called negative pressure breathing. So the idea of why they call it negative pressure breathing is in order for the air to get into your lungs, the pressure in your lungs must be less than atmospheric pressure. So it's going to have to be negative. That's why they call it negative pressure breathing. So let's look over some things before we actually go into the actual mechanics of how we breathe. So this is an important concept to know. You probably covered it in a previous course, undergraduate course. It's called Boyle's Law. Now, Boyle's Law is an important thing to know. Now, the equation, you do need to know that equation because to me, it's a conceptual equation. It shows you the relationship between pressure and volume. And you notice there's an indirect relationship. If you just, before we look at these pictures, if volume increases, this number is going to be a small number. So volume increases, pressure drops. If volume decreases, pressure will increase. So let's look at it. So let's look at, we have a container filled with these little particles of gas molecules, and it's showing you the volume of the container and the pressure. So pressure that you get in that container comes from the gas molecules colliding with the walls of the container. Okay, so these things are hitting the walls of the container, has a certain amount of pressure in here. The greater number of collisions, the higher the pressure. So what happens is if I decrease the volume of the container, I have not changed the number of gas molecules. What's going to happen here is I'm going to have more collisions against the side of the container. So as the volume decreased, you see it's I've halved the volume, pressure has increased. So think about if the idea of automobile tires. They're hard and they're very strong. They're designed to bear the weight of a car because the air is compressed to about 1/3 of the atmospheric volume that's in the tire. So you have a very high pressure in the tire. So one thing to always remember is that gas molecules will always try to fill their container. So large container, they'll have more distance apart, not as much collisions, pressure's low. Smaller container, greater amount of collisions, the greater the pressure. So what does this have to do with the mechanics of ventilation? So think about it. In order for us to get air into and out of our lungs, we have to have a pressure gradient. Remember I told you in physiology, pressure gradients rule. So I have to be able to change the volume of the container, my lungs, to change the pressure so I can get air into or out of my lungs, because you cannot change atmospheric pressure. So if I want to get air into and out of my lungs, I can't go out and go climb up and down a mountain so I can get atmospheric pressure to change. It's going to be pretty much the same constant as I'm sitting here. So I need to change the volume of my lungs so I can change the pressures in my lungs and therefore get air into and out of your lungs. So let's see how it works. So here, this is the scenario. You just exhaled. Okay, so this is your resting lung volume here. Right here in the black is your diaphragm in the relaxed state. You notice your diaphragm, when it's relaxed, it's kind of curved upward. This is your principal muscle of breathing. At that resting lung volume, pressure at this here represents your atmospheric pressure, and this is the pressure in the lungs. Now, just as a reference, we're just saying atmospheric pressure is 0. It is not 0, but just as a reference, it's 0. The pressure in the lungs is the same. So if pressure in and out are the same, there is no flow. Remember, no pressure gradient, no flow. You'll notice over on this picture here, this little squiggly line, that represents the elastic element of your lung. So again, what is so important about that elastic element of your lung? So let's look again. So here's those elastic fibers. Those elastic fibers are just kind of in their normal position at rest. What's going to happen when air comes in to those elastic fibers? So just kind of keep that in mind. Oops. Sorry about that. I gotta go, messed up my slide. Let's see. So, we're gonna do inspiration first. So here's the scenario. You have a nerves that are active, firing, that innervate the diaphragm and the muscles that are called the external intercostals. So one thing they have to remember is inspiration is an active process. You need the nervous system saying, okay, muscle, you need to contract. And so the nervous system is sending down impulses to the diaphragm. The diaphragm will then contract in response to that. And as it contracts, it flattens out, which will do what? To the top and bottom dimensions of the thoracic cavity. It's going to increase it. At the same time, the external intercostals are going to contract, which pulls the ribs up and outwards, which will again aid into increasing the volume of the pulmonary or thoracic cavity. So Boyle's law, what does Boyle's law tell you? If you increase volume, which is happening here, if you increase volume, what's going to happen to pressure? So pressure in the lungs is going to decrease. So here we've got our atmospheric pressure, just as a reference, will be 0. In the lungs, it's going to be less. So here's your negative pressure breathing. It's going to be subatmospheric, which will allow air to move down into the lungs. It follows a gradient. So you'll have air flow into the lungs. Now, this air will continue to flow into the lungs until the pressures are equalized. So at the end of inspiration, the atmospheric pressure will be the same as this would be your alveolar pressure, which is the pressure in your lungs. So as the air moves into the lungs, the air molecules start to fill up that cavity, pressures will start to increase until these guys are the same. At the same time, what you're seeing over here in the red and this here, that elastic element, you got those rubber bands surrounding the alveoli, they're going to stretch. So, I wonder what will happen when you stretch out a rubber band if you do not have any active firing of neurons or nerves to those muscles. So let's think about what's going to happen. So first, again, let's review. Because inspiration is an active process, we have nerves that are firing, causes those muscles of inspiration, the diaphragm, the external intercostals, they're going to contract. Increases the volume of the thoracic cavity, so pressures drop in the alveoli. So air moves into the lungs until the pressure is equalized. The elastic element stretches. But then what happens? Nerve impulses will then end. And what's going to happen? Expiration is, we're talking about normal expiration. Resting expiration is a passive process. So nerve impulses have ended. Because you have stretched out the elastic element in the lungs, they're going to want to go back to their original state. So due to elastic recoil, the lungs will go back to the original state. And what's going to happen? So the diaphragm moves back, the external intercostals relax. So what's going to happen to the volume in the thoracic cavity? Volume is going to decrease. So again, according to Boyle's law, volume decreases, pressure is going to increase. So now the pressure in the lungs is greater than atmospheric pressure. So air will move out of the lungs again until pressure is equalized. So normal inspiration is an active process. Normal expiration is a passive process. Just stop the nerve impulses. These guys go back to where they originally want to be. Air is going to move out of the lungs. So what about, and so here's again what we had just mentioned, resting inhalation is active, resting exhalation is passive. But forced breathing, you can move more air in your lungs if you need to. You can force more air out of your lungs. And one of the things we're going to do in lab is make you do forced breathing. So when you do forced breathing, you're going to have to get some accessory muscles involved. In forced inspiration, so you're just sitting here breathing normally. I say, hey, get as much air in your lungs as you possibly can. You're going to need to get some accessory muscles involved to get that thoracic cavity volume even bigger, so that pressure in the lungs drops even more, so you can get even more air into your lungs. So think about what type of muscles may be involved so you can get more air into your lungs. So this is when your anatomy kicks in. Anatomy is a real important part of physiology. They go hand in hand. And so what muscles will be involved, maybe allowing my rib cage to expand even more? Do you think maybe scalenes or sternocleidomastoid, pectoralis minor? What about the erector spinae muscles? So if the back extends, you can straighten out that thoracic curvature even more and get more air into your lungs. What about forced expiration? If you do forced expiration, it is definitely active. So you are going to get even more air out of your lungs. So you're going to have to get some accessory muscles here to allow you to get all this extra air out of your lungs. And we're going to be asking you to do this in lab. I want you to force all that air out of your lungs as you possibly can, just so you can't get any more out of your lungs. And you'll know you've done it right is when you're coughing and choking. And that's what we're going to be telling you to do in lab. Doesn't sound nice, but that's what's going to happen. So what kind of things would be involved in forced expiration? Just try it. Think about, feeling where your muscles are contracting. Don't you think the abdominals are going to be important? Primarily the oblique muscles and the transverse abdominis. So yeah, the abdominal muscles will be very important. What about the internal intercostals? They may depress the rib cage and decrease thoracic volume even more. So you have other things involved when you do forced expiration. So review again. Resting conditions, inhalation is active, exhalation is passive. Forced breathing, you're still going to have active inhalation, but you just need some accessory muscles. Forced expiration is definitely active. So you're going to decrease that thoracic volume even more to get the pressure real high in those lungs to force even more air out of the lungs. So let's look at some respiratory pressures and how they're important. So I put a lot of little things, extra stuff on this slide for you so you can fill it in as I go. So I want to review some of these pressures and why they're so important. So the first one, well, there's actually 4 pressures that are obviously important in breathing. You have 3 of them listed. The 4th is up here. And the reason why I didn't list them down here is this one, it's constant. These are the ones that will change during breathing. So we're going to, again, as a reference, we always say atmospheric pressure is 0, even though we know it's not 0. But it's 0, okay? The first pressure is the pleural pressure. You may also hear it referred to as intrapleural pressure. It's found here, represented by this -4 here. This pressure the units is always in centimeters of water, as well as the transpulmonary pressure, always in centimeters of water. I'll give you a way you can remember this, that it's centimeters of water. The pleural pressure is the pressure between the 2 pleura. This would be the visceral pleura, and this would be the parietal pleura, the pleural membranes that you have. They're serosal membranes. So there's a pressure that is between these 2, and why is it so important? It allows the lungs to expand with the thorax. It couples the lungs to the wall of your thorax, because there's no direct connection between your lungs and the thoracic wall. The only connection you have is way up here. If it didn't have that, would just kind of hang like nothing. Here, when the lungs contract, or not the lungs, I should say the thoracic wall contracts, this gets pulled out, this guy comes along with it. And so the lungs kind of get pulled along with it. In reality, also, keep in mind, there is really no space here. It's a potential space because these guys are stuck to each other because there's a little layer of fluid that lines this. But this pressure allows you to couple the lungs to the thoracic wall. So this will be lining that thoracic wall. This will be lining the lungs. One thing to keep in mind is that pleural pressure is always less than alveolar pressure. Always less than alveolar pressure. This pressure will vary with ventilation. It's during normal breathing, it's always negative, but it can become positive during forced expiration. Okay? The one thing I want you to think about and keep in mind is the thoracic wall always wants to go out in this way. It always does. The lungs always want to go in this way. So they are kind of opposing each other and creates kind of this negative pressure. What also is real important for creating that negative pressure is those lymphatics that kind of drain this area so we don't have a lot of fluid that accumulates there. We just have a little tiny bit there. We shouldn't have too much. So those lymphatics also kind of keep that pressure negative. Now, as a reference, just for you don't have to write this down, you can if you want, the centimeters of water, millimeters of mercury. A centimeter of water is equal to 0.76 millimeters of mercury. So you can convert the two, but generally, the physiologists will always refer to pleural pressure and your transpulmonary pressures in centimeters of water. So why they call this centimeters of water, pleural pressure? There's some fluid in here, water. That's why they call it, they do it in terms of centimeter of water. In here, this is representing our lungs. The pressure in here is the alveolar pressure, which you see here is 0, because this would be, we just finished exhalation, the pressures are the same, so there's no airflow. This pressure, alveolar pressure, will determine whether air is going to go in or out of your lungs. So if it's the same as atmospheric pressure, we're not having air going in or out. But if you move over to the picture on the right, in this case we saw the pressure drop, so air will move into the lungs. I should have drawn this picture a little bit different, so we had this air thing being a little bit bigger, because that's why the pressure dropped, because we increased the volume of the thoracic cavity. So if this pressure here is less than atmospheric pressure, air will move in. If it's greater, air will move out. So the alveolar pressure will always determine whether air goes in or out of your lungs. And you also notice here in this picture, the pleural pressure became even more negative. So kind of you're going to see that in another picture, that during ventilation, during respiration, the pressures do change. So during inhalation, the pressures actually become more negative in the pleural pressure. Now the last pressure is called the transpulmonary pressure. It literally means across. So the trans means across. So it's across the wall. So it's from here, here. So it's the pressure it's really the difference in pressure between the alveoli and the pleural pressure. So if I wanted to calculate it, you always take alveolar pressure and you subtract out pleural pressure and you'll get the transpulmonary pressure. This pressure will determine how much your lungs inflate. So this is a very important pressure. So it determines the degree of inflation of your lungs. So I want to kind of go over a little bit what your notes say about it's the measure of elastic force that tends to collapse the lungs. So I want you to think of it like this. Think of it as a force needed to stretch a rubber band. In order for me to stretch that rubber band, I have to, in this case, have the transpulmonary pressure enough that I can expand that lung even more. If I want to get the lungs even bigger, I need that transpulmonary pressure even more. If I want to stretch that rubber band even more, I got to exert more pressure. The idea, the reason why they say it's a measure of the force that tends to collapse the lung is, think about if you've got an elastic band. The elastic band always wants to recoil. It always wants to go back to its original state. So as you stretch the lungs out even more and more and more, that tendency for collapse increases. And your lungs always want to, or those alveoli always want to collapse. So as you expand the lungs out even more, that pressure is going to have to be even higher to prevent that collapse of the airways. Okay? We're going to be seeing that, the relationship between that transpulmonary pressure and lung volumes in a few slides. Okay, so this is a pretty important pressure. Again, it always is measured in centimeters of water. So this picture will show us what happens to the different pressures during normal respiration. And each of the pressures, alveolar, transpulmonary, and pleural pressures, do change during a breathing cycle. So we're going to start in the showing you in red is the alveolar pressure. So here is what's going on during inspiration. Over here is during expiration. So again, you see what happens to lung volumes during the breathing cycle. Obviously, during inspiration, lung volumes increase. During expiration, lung volumes decrease. So we're going to start over here at 0. You just finished exhaling. So pressure, alveolar pressure should be 0. It's going to be the same as atmospheric pressure. Notice what happens during inspiration. Alveolar pressures initially decrease. Okay? So again, why is alveolar pressures decreasing? As alveolar pressures decrease, or they're decreasing because you've increased the volume of the thoracic cavity. The diaphragm contracted. The external intercostals contracted. Volume has increased, so pressure has decreased. So you see the pressures decrease, lung volume increases. But you notice eventually all of a sudden you see the alveolar pressure start to go back up to 0. So at the end of inspiration, the pressure returned to 0. So why does that happen? So as air flows into the alveoli during inspiration, the number of air molecules in the alveoli begin to rise, so pressures will start to increase because it's filling up those airways. And so pressures will start to increase again until they're equalized and you're at the end of inspiration. Then you'll notice during expiration, alveolar pressures increase to a certain point, and then they come back down again, back to 0. So again, why is it increasing here? Because normal expiration, diaphragm relaxed, the external intercostals relaxed, so your volume of your thoracic cavity decreased, so air pressure in the lungs and the alveoli increase. And so what happens then? Air starts moving out. You see the lung volume start to decline. Now, the pressures start to decline as air molecules are leaving, so you have more air molecules leaving those airways, and so pressures start to go back to 0. So again, at the end of expiration, the alveolar pressure will be the same as atmospheric pressure. So then what happens with pleural pressures? So pleural pressures, where I'm drawing in green. So pleural pressures, you start here after a normal expiration. You notice again pleural pressure is less than alveolar pressure. It's always less than alveolar pressure. Under normal conditions, respiration, it is negative. Okay, so we have a negative pleural pressure. And during inspiration, it becomes more negative. And during expiration, it becomes less negative. But again, it's always, you notice, always less than alveolar pressure. So it does change with normal breathing, and it does change with forced breathing. If I was doing forced expiration, this can actually come and become positive if you do some really forced expiration. So pleural pressures also change with breathing. The last pressure is your transpulmonary pressure, which I've kind of highlighted in orange. It's the difference between alveolar and pleural pressure. So you'll notice pleural pressure, it's hard to do this when you're having to draw this by hand. So I want you to see if you can notice that where the transpulmonary pressure is the greatest. So remember, it's the difference between alveolar and pleural pressure. So transpulmonary pressure, if you start from here and start moving to your right during inspiration, you notice the distance is getting a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. So transpulmonary pressure increases, and this will allow you to get more and more air into your lungs. So this, again, I said, it determines the degree of inflation of your lungs. So where is it going to be the greatest? At the end of inspiration. That's where the transpulmonary pressure is the greatest. You'll get the most air in your lungs at the end of an inspiration, as the transpulmonary pressure will be less as you move down through expiration. So this determines the degree of inflation of the lungs. So let's kind of look at that transpulmonary pressure a different way. And why is that important? Why does it determine the degree of inflation of your lungs? So compliance. What we're going to be talking about is compliance and how that transpulmonary pressure is going to be important. So I want to, at this point, we're going to take a little bit of break. I'm going to go over compliance, and I'll go over, look at something called transpulmonary pressure again using the graph that you have in your notes. So we'll come back at a later point.